The wind rolled across the high desert like a living thing, cold enough to sting the skin and sharp enough to make a man question why he still fought for the life he had. Dawn hadn't even broken yet, but Jacob Holt was already out of bed, boots scraping against the frostbitten floorboards as he stepped outside the ranch house. The world was blue and silent, the Arizona sky still holding on to the last shreds of night, and somewhere beyond the ridge, a rifle cracked. One single shot. Too close. Too deliberate. And far too early for any honest man to be out hunting. Jacob's breath fogged the air as he paused, listening. The cattle had been restless since sundown, pacing, snorting at shadows. Something was stalking them. Wolves, he first thought, but wolves didn't fire rifles. And they didn't leave human-sized tracks around his watering trough. He pulled his coat tighter, adjusting the worn strap of his rifle across his shoulder. He hadn't slept well, not since Mary died last winter. Fever took her fast, leaving him alone on a ranch built for two. Some mornings he woke expecting to hear her humming by the stove. Other mornings he wished the cold would swallow him whole, so he didn't have to feel how empty the house had become. But loneliness didn't pay debts, and grief didn't hunt whatever was killing his cattle. Jacob saddled his horse, Slate, the gray gelding shivering under his touch. The animal sensed the tension too. Something out there was wrong. He rode east toward the foothills, toward the echo of that rifle shot. The frozen soil crunched under Slate's hooves. Jacob scanned the ground, searching for tracks. He found them soon enough. One set, light, careful, spaced like someone who traveled fast and avoided being followed. A scout's walk. Not a bandit. Not a settler either. Someone who knew the land better than he ever would. The trail cut through a narrow pass littered with juniper and shadow. Jacob slowed his horse, instincts prickling. This wasn't the first time he'd tracked a trespasser, but something about today made the hairs on his neck stand. He dismounted, tying Slate's reins to a branch so the animal wouldn't panic, then moved forward on foot, rifle raised. The silence was the kind that swallowed sound itself. No birds, no wind, no insects, only his heartbeat. Thump, thump, loud enough to feel in his throat. A faint rustle to his left made him pivot. Too late. Someone lunged out of the brush, knocking him backward. His rifle flew from his hands, clattering against the rocks. A figure pinned him down, fast, agile, stronger than expected. Jacob grabbed at their wrists, but a knife gleamed above him, slicing down in a deadly arc. He rolled, the blade grazing his coat, tearing cloth instead of flesh. They scrambled on the ground, trading blows, dust rising like smoke. The attacker moved with precision, with purpose. No wasted motion. Whoever this was had every intention of killing him. Jacob managed to catch their arm, twist, and slam them hard against a boulder. The knife clattered away. He pinned the figure, breathing hard, ready to strike again. But then he froze. His attacker was a woman. Young, maybe mid-20s. Hair dark as obsidian, braided tight against her head. Eyes sharp and burning with fury, not fear. Apache by her clothing. And wounded. A dark streak of dried blood ran down her shoulder, staining the leather of her tunic. She glared up at him, refusing to look away even though she had lost the advantage. Her breath came fast but steady, as if she'd already accepted death long before getting here. Jacob didn't know what to do. Killing her would ignite trouble with nearby tribes. Freeing her meant she might finish what she started and slit his throat the moment he turned his back. "Why were you tracking my land?" he asked, though he doubted she understood English. Her jaw tightened. No answer. He glanced at the wound on her shoulder. Deep. Fresh. Maybe the rifle shot. Maybe someone else hunted her too. Jacob stepped back, raising his hands slowly, so she understood he wasn't going to strike again. She tried to rise, but her knees buckled, and she stumbled. The fight had drained her strength. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The world around them remained frozen, caught between threat and mercy. Jacob lowered his gaze, then picked up his rifle. The woman tensed, preparing to defend herself, but he didn't raise it. Instead, he slung it over his back and reached for the coiled rope at his side. "Don't make me do worse than tie you," he muttered, voice low, uncertain whether he was talking to her or himself. She understood enough to glare fiercely, but she didn't resist as he bound her wrists. Not tightly, just enough to keep her from attacking again. He wasn't proud of restraining her, but letting her go after she ambushed him wasn't an option. His mind spun as he lifted her on his slate's back. She winced but made no sound. Apache pride, he knew. They wouldn't show pain even with bones sticking out. Jacob mounted behind her, keeping one arm firm around her so she wouldn't fall. Her back was rigid, tense, but she didn't fight. As they rode toward the ranch, Jacob felt the weight of what he'd done settling heavier than the winter air. Bringing an Apache woman into a white man's settlement was asking for trouble. Folks around here were already on edge. Rumors of raids, stories of missing livestock, murders blamed on tribes without proof. And he was about to ride right into that storm with her tied to his saddle. He didn't know her name, didn't know her story, didn't know why she'd attacked him, or who had shot her before he found her. But there was one truth he couldn't deny. This woman, this furious, wounded Apache scout, hadn't come to kill his cattle. She was running from something far worse. And without meaning to, without understanding how it would change everything that followed, Jacob Holt had just taken her into his life. The morning light crept slowly over the ridge as Jacob guided Slate through the frost-bitten grass, keeping the woman's form balanced in front of him. She didn't speak, didn't protest, only glared forward, eyes sharp and unyielding, as though daring him to make a mistake. Her presence was a constant reminder that he had crossed a line he hadn't even known existed until that morning. Back at the ranch, the barn stood empty except for the lowing of the few cattle left after the recent raids. Jacob led Slate into the corral and lifted the woman down with surprising gentleness. She wobbled, gripping the rope around her wrists but refusing to collapse. He noticed a wince, a slight shake in her hand, but she refused to acknowledge pain. He grimaced. Pride was a stubborn thing, especially with her kind. He set her down on a blanket in the corner of the barn, partially hidden from the main house. "You're lucky I don't just leave you out there," he said quietly. "Storm's coming. Wolves, coyotes, you wouldn't last." She didn't answer, just tilted her head slightly, studying him with those dark, unblinking eyes. Jacob caught a flash of defiance, and something else, something fragile beneath the fire. He knelt beside her, inspecting the wound on her shoulder. The arrow or bullet, he couldn't tell, had grazed a major muscle. Infection could set in fast. His hands trembled slightly as he tore a strip from his undershirt and pressed it to the wound. She flinched but didn't resist. "Name?" he asked, hoping to break the silence. Still nothing. He sighed, running a hand over his face. It wasn't like him to care about strangers, especially ones who ambushed him. But he felt it anyway, a strange, uncomfortable tug. A responsibility he hadn't asked for. The morning wore on. Jacob fetched water, food, and blankets while keeping one cautious eye on her. Every time a neighbor rode past, she ducked behind the blanket, silent but alert. Rumors had already begun to stir. Settlers were suspicious of Apache in the area, and one wrong word could have started a lynch mob. Jacob tried to explain, vaguely, when old Tom Henderson, the ranch hand, peered in. "You bringin' trouble in here, Jacob?" "I'm keeping her safe," Jacob said simply, tightening the rope just enough to prevent her from bolting. "She ain't what you think." Tom snorted but nodded. Some people understood better when words were few. Days passed. The woman, Jacob still didn't know her name, refused to eat at first, refusing even water for a long stretch. Slowly, hunger won. She accepted dry bread, tearing it with small, precise bites, still keeping a wary eye on him. He began calling her Nalin, a name that came to him in a moment of quiet desperation. It was close enough to what she whispered once in the night when pain kept her from sleeping. She didn't correct him. Trust was measured in small gestures. She helped him move a spooked horse without a word. One morning, when a coyote tried to take a calf, she threw a stone with such precision it struck the animal and sent it running. Jacob's jaw tightened. He hadn't expected this, hadn't anticipated the skills of someone so silent, so calculating. At night, by the fire, she watched him quietly. Sometimes he caught her mimicking his movements, mending a fence, stacking firewood, tending the animals. Each act brought them closer, though neither would admit it. It wasn't easy. Their lives had been shaped by mistrust, by history, by unspoken violence. She didn't speak English fluently. He knew nothing of her tribe's codes or ways. Every shared task was a negotiation, every glance a conversation. And then came the rumors. The bandits. Not Apache, not settlers. Real thieves, merciless and cunning, roaming the hills, taking livestock, burning homesteads, leaving bodies in their wake. Word reached Jacob that the group responsible for the raids had been sighted near the northern canyon. He glanced at Nalin. She stiffened, gaze snapping to the horizon. He noticed the small symbol she began drawing in the dirt. Simple marks, arrows, circles. A warning system? A message? Jacob realized something he hadn't thought of before. She wasn't just a survivor. She was a warrior, a scout, a protector, and she was planning, calculating, watching. The next attack didn't wait long. A group of masked men appeared at the far edge of the ranch at dusk, shadows slinking between rocks and brush. Jacob grabbed his rifle ready. Nalin stood beside him, hands still bound, eyes scanning. He felt the tension coil like a spring. The bandits came closer, unaware or underestimating the presence of two defenders. Nalin's foot nudged a stone, rolling it silently across the dirt. Jacob flinched at the precision. She knew exactly how to manipulate the environment, how to signal danger without a word. Jacob's heart raced. He had underestimated her, underestimated what she could teach him about survival, about facing enemies who didn't play fair. He realized the mistake he had made in capturing her, in assuming weakness where there was strength. By nightfall, the bandits had retreated. Small victories like these were rare, and Jacob felt a flicker of admiration mixed with fear. Nalin had saved him in ways he couldn't yet articulate. He noticed her watching him, a glimmer of respect or curiosity in her dark eyes. Days merged into nights. Trust was building, brick by brick, gesture by gesture. Jacob began to understand that Nalin's silence wasn't just defiance. It was strategy. Communication came through shared labor, through glances, through unspoken recognition of danger. The ranch was still in peril, the bandits still at large, and yet something had shifted. He was no longer alone, and she was no longer just a captive. She had become an enigma, a puzzle he was compelled to solve, not with words, but with observation, patience, and, slowly, reliance. One evening, as the sun bled across the desert sky, Jacob sat near the fire, cleaning his rifle. Nalin approached, her steps cautious but deliberate. She crouched near him, and for the first time, their eyes met in quiet understanding. A nod, a shared acknowledgement of the threats they faced together. Jacob realized then that his life had changed irrevocably. He hadn't set out to take in a companion, a teacher, or an ally. He had gone hunting, expecting the wilderness to challenge him, expecting the world to throw danger in familiar shapes. Instead, he had found something far more profound, a presence that could teach him not just survival, but resilience, courage, and the unspoken truths that only hardship could reveal. And yet the tension remained. The bandits were out there, moving closer with each passing day. Nalin's secrets were still hidden behind that quiet mask. And Jacob knew that the real test, the one that would measure the strength of their fragile alliance, was still ahead. The desert was beautiful in its quiet menace. The night deepened, and in the shadows of the barn, two lives intertwined in a way neither could yet fully understand. The storm came without warning, a rolling wall of dark clouds and icy wind that whipped across the plains. Jacob had been repairing a fence when the first drops fell, heavy and cold, splattering the dirt and the scattered hay. Slate whinnied nervously, stomping his hoofs. Nalin was already moving, adjusting the ropes on her wrists with quick, precise motions, as if anticipating what was coming. By nightfall, the storm was relentless. Rain battered the roof of the barn, drumming like gunfire. The wind tore at the wooden planks, and somewhere in the distance, Jacob heard the faint echo of men shouting. Bandits, no doubt, emboldened by the darkness. The cattle lowed, panicked, pressed against the pens, eyes wide and shining. Jacob grabbed his rifle, heart hammering. Nalin was beside him, stoic, silent, her dark eyes scanning the shadows outside. He realized with a jolt that he had come to rely on her presence in ways he didn't yet understand. Alone, he might have been paralyzed with fear, but together they formed a small, unspoken unit. The first bandit appeared on the ridge, silhouetted against the flashes of lightning. Jacob fired, a sharp, violent sound that echoed through the storm. Nalin moved with astonishing speed, her hands still bound, using a piece of rope to trip another attacker who had slipped too close. He barely had time to process what he was seeing before she was already back on her feet, crouched and ready, eyes scanning the storm-dark hills. By dawn, the barn was partially destroyed, its door torn off its hinges, but the bandits had retreated. Jacob surveyed the damage, cursing under his breath. Nalin was crouched nearby, tending to slate, her hands moving deftly despite the swelling bruise on her shoulder. She had saved him, again, and yet he could feel the weight of his guilt pressing against his chest. He had brought her into danger, exposed her to threats she did not ask for, and now, because of him, their lives were a storm of violence and uncertainty. They had no choice but to flee. Jacob led them into the wilderness, away from the burned-out barn and the ruins of his ranch. The landscape was unforgiving, jagged rocks, hidden ravines, and mud-slick slopes that threatened to swallow their feet. Every step was calculated. Every sound, a snapping twig, a distant coyote howl, was a potential threat. The nights were the worst. Frost bit their exposed skin, hunger gnawed at their stomachs, and a constant fear of pursuit never let them rest. Jacob watched Nalin closely, noting how she moved silently through the underbrush, how she read the land like a language. He began to learn from her, noticing the subtle signs of approaching danger, the way she could track an animal, or a man, without leaving a mark herself. One evening, huddled beneath a sparse pine, Jacob broke the silence. "I'm sorry," he muttered, voice low, "for everything, for taking you, for dragging you into this mess." Nalin said nothing, only watched him with those unreadable eyes. He swallowed the lump in his throat, the memories of Mary surfacing unbidden. The pain of losing her had never truly left him. Now, with Nalin beside him, he was forced to confront it again. "Bandits," he said finally, trying to break the silence. "They're the same ones who killed your brother, aren't they?" Her eyes flicked down, briefly, almost imperceptibly, before returning to his. A nod. That was all. The realization hit him like a blow. Their fates were intertwined by the same enemy. The same violence that had stolen his wife had stolen her family. And now, together, they were the hunted. They moved cautiously through the canyon the next morning, avoiding the main trails, traveling only when the sun was low and shadows were long. Nalin showed him how to read the wind, how to recognize the faint scent of humans, how to listen for the subtle signs of animals disturbed by movement too quick, too silent. Every lesson was a revelation. He had thought he understood the land, but she was teaching him a deeper language, one that required patience and humility. One night, as they huddled around a small fire, Nalin produced a bundle of dried herbs and began tending to a wound on Jacob's arm, a shallow cut from the previous night's escape. The act was simple, almost tender, and yet it carried a weight neither of them spoke aloud. Trust, Jacob realized, was growing between them, not through words, but through shared hardship and survival. Days merged into nights, and the bandits' threat loomed larger with each passing hour. Jacob felt a transformation stirring within him. He was no longer merely a man defending his ranch, driven by grief and stubbornness. He was part of a partnership forged in fire and blood, bound by necessity, but deepened by respect and understanding. In a quiet moment, as they rested on a rocky outcrop overlooking a valley, Jacob spoke again. "I lost my wife last winter," he said, voice barely audible over the rustle of leaves. "Fever. Too fast. Too cruel. He looked at Nalin, unsure why he was revealing this, but compelled nonetheless. Some nights I wake up expecting her to be there, and she isn't. Nalin did not reply in words. She reached out, placing her hand briefly on his forearm, and squeezed. A simple gesture, but it carried more meaning than any sentence could. Pain, loss, and a tentative hope of survival, shared, unspoken. They continued their journey, moving through hidden ravines and along narrow ridges, until they finally spotted the campfire of the bandits in the distance. Nalin's eyes narrowed, lips pressed tight. She began to sketch a series of symbols in the dirt, a warning, a plan, a map of danger. Jacob realized she had been preparing for this moment all along. The alliance between them was no longer tentative. It was real, forged in violence and strengthened by shared hardship. They had survived storms, hunger, and attack. Now, they would confront the bandits together, not as captor and captive, but as equals. And Jacob knew, with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified him, that nothing about the world ahead would be the same. He had learned to trust Nalin. He had learned to follow her lead, to watch and wait, to act with precision. He had also learned that fear, pain, and grief were not weaknesses. They were the fire that forged strength. The wind howled across the canyon as they crouched among the rocks, the bandits' fire flickering in the distance. Jacob checked his rifle, tightened his grip on his knife, and looked at Nalin. She nodded once, just barely, a signal they both understood. The confrontation was coming, the final test, and neither of them would face it alone. The canyon was quiet, too quiet. Jacob crouched behind a jagged rock, rifle in hand, heart hammering. Nalin mirrored him a few feet away, dark eyes scanning, muscles coiled like springs. The fire from the bandits' camp flickered below, casting long, twisted shadows. Every movement could betray them. Every sound could summon death. Jacob had never felt so alive. Every sense was heightened, the cold air biting at his cheeks, the smell of damp earth and smoke, the faint metallic tang of fear that clung to him. He glanced at Nalin. Her shoulder wound was healing, but he could see the strain etched into her jaw, the tension in her hands. Yet she moved like a predator, silent, deliberate, focused. He had learned more from her in these past weeks than from any man he had ever known. The plan was simple in theory. Approach quietly, take out the sentries, and confront the leader. In practice, it was a delicate dance on the edge of a knife. One wrong move, and the canyon would echo with gunfire and screams. A sentry shifted near the fire, scratching his head. Nalin flicked her hand. Jacob understood immediately. Throw the small stone near the opposite ridge to distract him. The man turned instinctively, giving them a narrow window. Jacob slid down the rock face, careful not to make a sound. Nalin followed, her movements fluid, almost invisible. The first two bandits fell before they could react. Short, sharp bursts of gunfire, followed by silence. Jacob barely had time to breathe before another figure lunged at Nalin. She pivoted, driving him backward with a swift kick, then disarmed him in a single, brutal motion. Jacob covered her, taking out a third attacker. The canyon erupted into chaos. Smoke, dust, and shouts filled the air. Jacob's heart raced, every muscle screaming in tension. He ducked behind a boulder as a bullet zipped past, thudding into the rock beside him. Nalin was a shadow, moving from one threat to the next with uncanny precision. He realized that survival wasn't just skill, it was instinct, honed by hardship and pain. She had lived this life, and now he was living it with her. The leader emerged from behind a tree, tall and cruel, eyes glinting with malice. He raised his rifle. Jacob fired. The shot missed by inches. Nalin dove at the man, knocking him to the ground. They wrestled, limbs flailing, until Jacob seized a fallen rifle and delivered the final shot. The leader lay still, eyes wide with shock, the life draining from him as quickly as the canyon had swallowed the echoes of battle. Breathing hard, Jacob looked at Nalin. She was bleeding from a shallow cut across her cheek, her chest rising and falling rapidly. Relief washed over him. They had survived. together. But the victory was bitter. The canyon was strewn with bodies, a stark reminder of the cost of vengeance. Jacob's gaze fell to the ground, to the lives lost in pursuit of justice. He realized that survival wasn't just about strength. It was about choices, about who you trusted and who you were willing to fight for. When the last echoes of battle faded, Nalin sank to her knees beside a small fire, exhausted. Jacob knelt next to her, carefully removing the ropes from her wrists. She didn't speak. She simply looked at him, and in that look was gratitude, respect, and something more profound, a shared understanding forged in the crucible of danger. Days later, they returned to the ranch. It was scarred, partially burned, a testament to the storm they had survived. Jacob began repairs, his hands steady and sure, but his mind lingered on the bond he had formed with Nalin. She moved silently through the property, checking fences, tending animals, her presence no longer a mystery, but a constant reassurance. And then came the moment he had known would arrive. Nalin approached him at dawn, her eyes somber, her shoulders squared. The time had come for her to return to her people. Jacob felt the weight of the impending farewell press down on him like the desert sun at noon. "I can't stay," she said finally, her voice soft but firm. Words had never been her strongest weapons, but they carried authority. "I belong to my people. My path is not here." Jacob swallowed hard. He had come to care for her, perhaps in ways he hadn't admitted even to himself. But he knew she was right. Their connection had been forged in survival, not in permanence. They had shared hardship, trust, and fleeting moments of understanding. That was enough. He handed her a small leather pouch, worn and faded, containing medicine and herbs her brother had once taught her to use. "For your journey," he said quietly, "to remember that not everyone you meet will harm you." She accepted it, fingers brushing his briefly, a gesture that spoke volumes. Then, without another word, she turned and disappeared into the dawn, moving like a shadow across the prairie, leaving Jacob alone with the rising sun and the weight of his own transformation. Jacob stood there, watching her vanish, feeling the emptiness settle around him. But it was different now. He was no longer the man who had woken that cold morning to hunt cattle. He had survived storms, ambushes, and the wilderness itself. He had learned to trust, to fight, to endure, and, most importantly, to see beyond fear and prejudice. The ranch would be rebuilt. He would tend his cattle, repair his fences, and face the world with a newfound resilience. And though Nalin was gone, her presence lingered, a quiet reminder that life was richer, more profound, and far more complicated than he had ever imagined. As the wind swept across the plains, Jacob lifted his gaze to the horizon, where the first rays of sun touched the desert like gold on fire. He whispered a silent thanks, not just for survival, but for the lessons learned and the bond forged in adversity. In the silence that followed, the world seemed to hold its breath. Life would continue, fragile yet enduring, shaped by courage, resilience, and the choices made in the face of danger. Jacob knew he would never forget Nalin, not her skills, her courage, or her silence, but the way she had changed him irrevocably and profoundly. The camera pans outward, capturing the vast desert, the rebuilt ranch, and the horizon stretching infinitely. A lone figure rides across the plain, a symbol of survival, transformation, and the quiet endurance of the human spirit. Some journeys begin with fear, some with anger, and some with the unexpected presence of another soul who teaches you what it truly means to endure. Jacob Holt found more than survival in the wilderness. He found trust, courage, and the knowledge that life, even after loss, can still change forever. If you enjoyed this story, hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more tales from the frontier. Every like and subscription helps bring these cinematic adventures to life, and your support keeps the stories of courage, resilience, and unexpected alliances alive. Don't forget to ring the bell for notifications so you never miss the next adventure.